Good evening, everyone. Good evening, and welcome to Tesa's Rants and Musings. All right, it's 9 o'clock. Come on in the room. Come on in the space. I see some of you are already here. Hey, Teresa. Hey, Mom. Hey, Cheryl. Come on in the room. This is an episode you don't want to miss. We have a special guest tonight who's going to talk to us about race, medicine, and the pursuit of theological liberation. We got a lot to talk about, so I don't have a whole lot of time to wait for people to get in. You guys know how I feel about that. They'll get it when they get it. Okay, but I want to leave him as much time as possible to be able to share with us about his book, about his work in this field, and to just help us process what's been happening in our communities around race, around health, around the medical profession, and all of that good stuff. And we could talk about all of that forever. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. And I want to make sure I leave him as much space as possible. So come on, let's get started. Yay! Welcome again to Tesa's Rants and Musings. We got a lot to talk about. Tonight's episode is about medical stigmata. And if that name, isn't that a fascinating name? We're going to talk about that with an author and friend of mine, Dr. Kirk Johnson. But before we even bring him on, hey, Peggy, before we even bring him on, I just want to set up the context about why we're even talking about this. As you guys already know, I kind of started this whole conversation, this whole Tesa's Rants and Musings with the onset of COVID, the way it impacted our communities, how it just seemed like we were really reeling from the effects of healthcare disparities and the fact that racism is so prevalent in our healthcare systems that we were dying seemingly at exorbitant rates more than others. And so this conversation tonight just kind of gives us some kind of understanding about how far back some of this goes. I posted about articles that were in the newspaper not too long ago about eugenics programs that were in Virginia, in North Carolina, in California, where there was forcible sterilization of Black and brown people in prisons, Black and brown people in communities. And so, this stuff is real, right? It's not in our heads. We've been dealing with this for a long time. So I thought this would be a great time to talk about it. And then when we think about what happened with Breonna Taylor, when we think about what is the value of a Black body, what is the value of a Black woman's body, what's the value of a Black woman's life, and where does this devaluing stem from, and how far back do we have to go to even understand how we can come to a verdict like we had yesterday? So without further ado, let me bring on someone who can help us try to make sense of some of this. He can't get to it all tonight, but his name is Dr. Kirk Johnson. He is a fellow colleague of mine and alum from Drew University. He's a professor at several universities, and forgive me if I don't read his entire bio to you tonight, but he is, just when I was trying to read it, he teaches courses in medical humanities, bioethics, global issues, philosophy, and religion. He is clergy in the UCC, which is United Church of Christ. He's on several boards, and he's just all that and a bag of chips. And he is also the author of Medical Stigmata: Race, Medicine, and the Pursuit of Theological Liberation. As you see, I had to go back through the book and I got my tabs in there. It's a fascinating read. It was a difficult read because the stories and just the realities of what Black bodies have been through is just hard. But yeah, he's here to talk to us about it. So let me bring him on in. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Kirk Johnson. Hi, Kirk.
Hey, good evening, everyone. It's good to see you.
Yay. Thank you so much. I know you're a busy guy. You got a lot going on, but I so appreciate the fact that you're willing to come on the show and just talk to us about your book, talk to us about eugenics, talk to us about just how race and medicine has been plaguing our community. And then what do we do about it? What do we do? You're clergy, you're a minister. What do we do as Black people, as the Black church, to address some of this stuff? But before you even get into it, I want you guys to know that Kirk was kind enough to give a discount, and I should say get 20% off his book in all formats. So it's in the comments. There's the promo code. There's the link. You want to get this book, okay? It is definitely a fascinating read. It clarifies so much. So let's just get into it. Thank you, Kirk, for being here. Help us. We had the articles about eugenics, and it's almost like, and you talk about this in your book, of Black oral tradition. It's things we heard about in our communities where we have this overwhelming distrust of the medical profession that our grandparents had, and we've just passed it on through our generations. But I don't think I've ever known in my looks like he got stuck. Are you there? You look frozen. Oh no, Kirk is frozen.
We're good.
Oh, okay. We're freezing on my end. So it looks like I don't know if I've in my lifetime ever seen proof, though, like such an enormous amount of proof that these atrocities were actually happening to Black people and Black bodies. So why don't you just tell us a little bit about what eugenics is, how race and medicine and all of that good stuff?
Yeah, sure. Well, eugenics, actually, the root word EU stands for well, and genics is born, so well born. And it's a particular understanding of linking race with biology. And this actually started as early as the 1850s, actually, that really was adopted in American culture. So Charles B. Davenport is deemed the father of American eugenics. And basically, that was from 1850 to all the way to 1950. But of course, Charles B. Davenport was in the early to mid 20th century. And what's so interesting about Davenport is that he really aligned himself with Charles Darwin and Darwinism, but also aligned with individuals that believed in these type of particular ideologies, believed in these ideas. And Charles Darwin's cousin actually created the idea of eugenics. He coined it eugenics. Before it was called race hygiene. And these particular ideas were actually transferred over to Europe. And a lot of people, of course, and rightfully so, shake their fist at the Holocaust with, Nazism and Nazi Germany, which was, of course, one of the sins of humanity. But guess where Adolf Hitler got these ideas from? Got it from America first, and then was adopted to Europe later on. And what Charles B. Davenport actually did was he created the Eugenics Records Office, which actually dictated life, where you went to school, where you lived, where you were born, what hospitals you go to. Every facet of life actually was determined by the Eugenics Record Office. And there's been tons of, I like to call pseudo articles. In the medical establishment today actually will laugh at the articles back then in those particular times of saying, yes, there are different races. And actually, believe it or not, at one point, the white race was classified in 45 different type of white individuals. And of course, over time, that changed into lumping white individuals as just one particular race. Your Eastern Europeans, when they came over early in the 20th century, what was interesting is, Italians, Hungarians, Irish, Jewish individuals, as well as Blacks, Asians, and Hispanics were deemed as lesser than, right? And in many ways today, from that particular history, we do see that. So eugenics also had a great deal regarding immigration. there was only a certain amount of folks you could let in our country,
That's
right?
right.
And these ideologies still exist today, even more so in regarding immigration. So, for example, most recently, ICE were doing hysterectomies on individuals, specifically who are these individuals, right? Part of the Hispanic population, Latinx as a whole, right? And there's a long history of that as well within that particular population. So, and even now, doctors still believe, unfortunately, even though they laugh at the research of those articles in the 1800s, early 1900s, mid 20th century, they still believe in the concept of race and that they're, you know, people of color are biologically different.
Right.
And that impacts, unfortunately, the health outcomes within the clinics right now. So, again, this is a really complex issue.
Yeah.
But one thing I would target and say is that, number one, we just have to say race is a social political construction. It's not biological, especially in the age of genetics where we have ancestry DNA, where we could really break down our ancestry. Me, myself, of course, I'm about 86% Black. The other 14% are from other different European countries, even Jewish, according to some particular tests that I have in my DNA, right? For example. So that in itself deconstructs and really obliviates the concept of race, right? You know, just because you have a certain pigmentation, you have more melanin in your skin, you're innately different than somebody else. Well, genetically, that is not the case. We're
Wow.
99.9% the same. It's the 0.01% external traits that make us different.
Wow.
So there's so many different myths that we still need to debunk today.
So if I could just kind of sum up, and I took some stuff from your book to put some definitions out there so people are really clear as to what we're talking about. So if we go back, what you're saying, actually, what eugenics really is, and all of this is from his book, you guys. So that's why you got to get the book. Okay, I'm quoting it directly from his book. So it starts with this belief, it sounds like you're saying, that somehow we are genetically different, and what ends up happening is, or what ended up happening is that there's this belief that whiteness was superior and anything other was inferior genetically.
Correct.
Okay, got that right. Now, this was not just happening in America, it was happening in other places, but in America, it seemed like that philosophy led to more of trying to eradicate and get rid of, or do away with what seemed to be the inferior group.
Correct.
Wow.
Correct. And within that, that was also adopted within Nazi Germany. So not only, unfortunately, our Jewish brothers and sisters had endured that sin, but what isn't mentioned really in the history books was Black people were also exterminated in Germany. Individuals who are part of the LGBTQ plus community were exterminated. Individuals who were disabled, or as I like to term differently able, were also exterminated as well in those Nazi camps. And even in an American context, that was used as justification of treating certain groups in a different light, in a different way, because they were genetically inferior. They were holding back the progress of society. And we see that even now with a lot of the political language and ideologies that we see today that has always been there, but now have been emboldened to resurface in a way that we haven't seen in a while. Usually it's whispers in, behind closed doors, but now it's more emboldened and more blatant than it has been ever before. And that is rooted within the understandings of eugenics. Medicine itself has shaped society. Society hasn't shaped medicine, but in this context, medicine has shaped society and how we actually think about each other and about difference.
You said this in your book. You said that eugenic perceptions of the Black body produced misappropriation and falsified theories of the anatomy and biology of Black individuals. And this is where we get that concept or this idea that Black women are stronger and can endure pain. So they can just experiment on us and do, I think of Henrietta Lacks and all those different people that suffered because we are genetically strong and different. And it makes you even think about the language we use for our athletes, right? When they talk about, oh yeah, he's a beast. Oh yeah, he's a workhorse. We don't necessarily link that language. Where it really comes from, though, is this idea that the Black body is somehow more animalistic, more primal, more stronger and brute than the average body.
Correct. And that also leads to the justification of treating Black and brown bodies as brutes, as being threatened, right?
Yes.
And this is connected to the criminality of Black bodies, right? So, for example, Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, Dr. Khalil Muhammad's book, The Condemnation of Blackness, talks about this really explicitly regarding the criminal justice system, right? We know what just happened regarding Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, and unfortunately, the list goes on with unarmed Black individuals. Well, why are they always being killed? Because when your skin is viewed as the weapon, you're always armed, right? When your skin is viewed as a threat, you're always armed, right?
Oh my God.
So,
wait. You got to slow down. Say it again. When your skin is viewed as the weapon.
Right. You're always armed.
Wow.
And because of that, it's something that is integrated within our society, right? So the depth of fear, right? The xenophobic fear of Black people has been rooted ever since, the first slaves came across the shores from Africa, right? And it was all good and cool when we as Black people, quote unquote, stayed in our place, created the economies, never benefited from it. It was all cool. But then, of course, after slavery happened and the Emancipation Proclamation became in existence, and then we started with the Reconstruction period, and we finally tried to make progress, that was deemed as a threat because it's okay that you have progress, but it's not okay to you have too much progress. You have to have a certain level of progress in order for you to stay in your place, in order for you to stay in your lane. Because if you continue to progress, then there was a threat or belief that we would supersede and overcome overall society and treat, those who oppressed us the same way, right? And even now, that is the same mentality, unfortunately. And it's unfortunate because Black Americans, we're very forgiving. Look how many times people have been killed. Look how many times we've been treated historically, but yet we give back to our country, right? We fought in every single war. Even in the first painting of General George Washington, there was an African American right in the painting fighting a war with the first president. We fought in every war. We've contributed in art, in music, in entertainment, in so many other ways, right? And yet we're still being treated in this particular way under the assumption that, well, we have to treat these individuals this way because it's justified. They're inferior to us, right? And it goes all the way back to the eugenic understanding of race, which of course was just a justification to treat individuals in an oppressive and degrading way. So history repeats itself, right? And it's very important for us to know the history. So we're, again, the great saying, right? Those that don't know their history are doing to repeat it, right? So it's really important for us to understand this history. And of course, don't act out in vengeance, which I know there's segments that would like to physically act out in vengeance, which of course I don't agree with. But understand the history so we can educate and empower and say, this is how we treated these groups of people over the past. What can we do, not just for reconciliation, but restitution, repairing, right? Be
Right.
repairers of the breach, to use Dr. William Barber's, Reverend Dr. William Barber saying, repair the harm that has been done, right? But
And
first
it's
we have to
still being done.
acknowledge the harm. First we have to acknowledge it first, which we still haven't done. Once we acknowledge it and repent from it, then we can move on. And I think the tensions and the groanings that we have right now is that we're delirious. We're under the assumption that everything was okay. There's no such thing as racism, which of course there is. But of course, until we tackle the problem first and acknowledge that there's systems and structures in
Right.
place,
Right.
then we can move forward for healing. But we're not even daring acknowledging what's happening right now. So that's a huge issue that we're dealing with right now.
It's a huge issue, and I think, and I let we have some colleagues that came in the room. Hey, Linda. Hey, Angelita. And different ones have come on to join the conversation with us. It's good seeing you guys here tonight. And these are our ministers, so forgive me if I'm not using your title. I'm just reading off the list. But you
hello,
said
all
something.
Reverend Doctors. Hello.
Yes, all the Reverend Doctors are in the house. Thank you for joining us, because this is such a critical conversation. Because I think, and I don't want us to move too fast through what we're talking about here, because sometimes I think we don't really get that there has been, almost since we've gotten here into this country, a systematic demonic force to keep us oppressed in almost every facet of our lives, right? With educationally, financially, spiritually. You talk about how the Black church was birthed out of a need to want to stop the dehumanization and discrimination as counter to what was happening in white churches, right? That's how the Black church even got created. But we go from this philosophy that we're somehow genetically inferior. It leads to people then thinking it's okay to experiment on us. And you go through your book, different examples of how slaves were experimented on and how different people were experimented on. And then it goes into this population control. Wanting to now make sure, we don't keep having children out there and procreating these inferior little beings in the world. And then that goes into this whole race-based medicine thing that we now are seeing the result of with these health disparities. We're seeing it in our own eyes. We knew it all along. Black folk knew we weren't getting optimal care. We've been talking about it, complaining about it. It took stars like Serena Williams to almost die for it to really take a front page, that when especially Black women open their mouths to doctors, there's this aggression against them, and there's this sense of our voices needing to be silenced, and it's caused us to want to die. But I caused us to die. What I think, though, we don't always talk about, that you kind of touch on, though, is how some of that we start believing ourselves. So we start thinking that certain conditions are just Black people diseases.
Right.
So we start thinking, like they would tell like to us to believe that COVID, let's say COVID is a Black disease. It's really a Black and brown people disease. Or you started talking about with sickle cell anemia all the way back then, it being a Black disease, and how now this race-based medicine and it's tied to profit and like it just feels like it has interwoven itself into almost every fabric of our lives in our quest for just survival. And it's like, okay, but I don't know if we even realize how much is there. I don't even know, like, until I saw those articles, I really didn't know that was really happening.
Right. Well,
yeah, help me figure out, like, what do we do with this, like, and how do we stay on top of it? How do you make sure you're not buying into because again, that's that internalized oppression, where we start buying into what they keep telling us, that somehow Black women are stronger than the rest, and we can just put the world on our shoulders, and it feels that way.
Right. Well, first, Black women are probably, and now it's popular because athletes and celebrities are tweeting it and posting it. but Black women are historically the most, unfortunately, oppressed group. When you talk about intersectionality, Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, and you're talking about it's different, being, of course, Black people of color in general are oppressed. But when you look at the social structure, unfortunately and historically, Black women are at the bottom. And they are the ones that always deal with the particular pain. And when I say at the bottom, I don't mean that they're inferior. I'm just talking
No, I
about
know exactly what you mean.
the
Yeah.
people that get the most hurt and the most pain and trauma are African American women and also Hispanic women as well, at the bottom of the social totem pole. And usually they're the ones that are oppressed, overlooked, mistreated, abused, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? And this is more in mainstream media right now because unfortunately what happened to Breonna Taylor in that particular
Right.
incident. And to talk to you about or to expound about um, our understanding and mistrust of the medical system, and with COVID-19 specifically, is that it has to do a lot with the mistrust of our history, but it also has to deal with us um, having to empower ourselves, right? And to educate ourselves. Not to say that we don't, right? There is a lot of empowerment, but I think this is where our religious institutions can actually come into play and be more of a resource and have actually partnerships, have health ministries, for example. Um, so it's something that we really need to implement within our churches, to have health ministries, to talk about mental health, right? Mental health is probably one of the most underappreciated topics within the Black church because the assumption is, oh, I don't need help. I just pray and give it to Jesus and everything will be all right. We have songs, amazing popping, snapping, clapping, toe tapping songs about that. And yes, it's good to pray. It's good to meditate. It's good to pray to Jesus Christ or to Allah or whatever, the various particular religions we as people of color, worship and actually utilize in our day-to-day lives. But there's also the mental, physical part that we have to also really be accounted for, right? And just because you go to a therapist or psychologist doesn't necessarily mean that you have no faith in God. I think, if you have a heart issue, you go to the cardiologist, right? Well, if you have a mind issue, we just spiritualize it and give it to God. No, you need to see a therapist, right? You need to see a psychologist, especially because of the trauma of racism that Black people have to deal with day to day. And you
Yeah.
don't have a proper outlet to really share and access that emotion in a proper way, right? That's psychologically detrimental to your own health, right? And how can your spirit be in check with God if your mind and your body's out of whack? It's not, right? You have to have the mind, body, and spirit to be in one in order for you to be fully healthy and well and whole, right?
But
So the
not
mental
you
health
preaching.
aspect is important. And the last thing I'll say before I know you have a comment is that I think also Black churches have, and just churches in general, or mosques or temples or whatever spiritual religious context you're in, we need to partner with nonprofit health organizations. People don't know this, but there are grants available from the American Heart Association, the Lupus Foundation, the Sickle Cell Anemia Foundation, American Heart and Stroke Association, American Cancer. There are grants that we could utilize in our own communities, in our own religious contexts. Number one, that could create employment opportunities, but also we could control our own health and our own, not just qualitative elements of health, the quality of health we get, but the quantity measuring, okay, how many people in our communities are actually sick, right?
Right.
What do they need? What are the resources they need, right? There's so much untapped opportunity that we don't actually are tapping into, right? Why is that? Of course, I don't know. Maybe because we don't know we could have those opportunities. I don't know. But
Right.
there's so many different avenues and ways that we could actually create a healthy climate for ourselves. The last thing I'll say about COVID-19 and sickle cell anemia, regarding as a quote unquote Black disease. They're not Black diseases because diseases don't They're no respect of persons.
Right.
They don't care what you look like, right? It's based on where you live. It's based on your access to healthcare. It's based on your understanding of health education. It's based on your genetics. It's based on how you eat. Diet is very important in your health. It's based on a lot of different things other than the melanin in your skin. So I have
Right.
to make that perfectly clear. But the medical institutions market it in a way to say that only Black people have sickle cell anemia. That's not true.
Right.
If your ancestry is from the Mediterranean area geographically, your body naturally interacts and sickles the cells as a bodily defense from malaria, right? As a bodily defense from a malaria.
Wow.
So you could talk to any hematologists who are blood experts. That is why cells sickle, not because you have more melanin in your skin, right? So even back in the day when white people had sickle cell anemia, they were castigated out of their white community because of this premise of white purity, right? So if you had
Right.
sickle cell anemia and you were white, it's like, oh, you're not white. You get out of here. You're not, you're not part of that white purity ideology, right? And even back then, in those particular times, you could literally change race crossing state lines, right? That's where the one drop rule comes into play, right? In Florida, if you're 1/18th of a Black, you're Black. If you have any Black blood in you in Arkansas, you're Black. You literally could cross state lines because, again, race is so fluid. It's a social construction based on where you are. You can literally change race across state lines back
Right.
in the 1800s and
Right.
1900s, right? So, again, and this is such a complex issue with so many different branches, but these are just some things that we ought to consider when we're talking about racism, but also racism in medicine.
So, because you said a lot about what some of the things possibly that we can do, but it seems like to me one of the biggest barriers in the community is this pervasive distrust of doctors, this pervasive distrust of the medical profession. So it's a real barrier for us, like a real barrier for us to believe, oftentimes in the diagnosis that we've been given, a barrier for us to believe in taking the medication that's been prescribed to us, because you also talk in your book about the monetizing, and
Of
the
drugs. Mm-hmm.
of the drugs and giving drugs to, like, we have been so um abused, for lack of a better word, or exploited, I think is the word I'm really thinking of, that now, it's so much. I think of the vaccines that's supposed to be coming for COVID. My distress says, and I posted, I'm waiting for the iPhone. I always wait for the second or third iteration. Wait till it
Right,
gets
right.
I'm not going to be a part of the first go round, right? But we as Black people just don't trust. And we heard, it came out in the news of those, I believe they were British or French doctors, talking about take the vaccines trials to Africa and just give it to African women,
Right,
to try it on them. We've
right,
been used so much as just pawns, and as if our lives and bodies weren't worth anything. How do we overcome that barrier of distrust? How do we overcome feeling like, or like we're losing opportunities because we don't know what's out there, that can help us in our communities, but we still don't trust what people are telling us and trying to give us? How do we combat that? And yeah.
right. Well, first, I think, and I had conversations. I had the privilege to have conversations with doctors and medical schools about this. First, there has to be an acknowledgement of mistreatment from the medical establishment. There has to be, whether it's from the American Medical Association, which is one of the major, is from the Center of Disease Control. It has to be public acknowledgement and repentance of, we treated a bunch of, not just Black folks, but people in color in general, a certain way. We repent, we acknowledge we're sorry, and not just say that, but what are the steps next that we need to do? we need to invest back into those communities. We have to make sure they have healthcare, access to healthcare. We need to build hospitals in those communities. There's so many hospitals in communities of color that are closed down.
Yeah, they
And if
shut
you
them
want to
down.
go to a hospital, you have to travel so far. How does that positively impact health? It doesn't, right? So, from an institutional and federal and statewide standpoint, there has to be acknowledgement and repentance and intentionally putting money and programs into place in order to alleviate that, in order to get more Black doctors, Black female and male doctors as well into medical schools, right? So that's from a macro approach. The second, of course, that's going to take years. What can we do now? Always get a second opinion, right? Um, Reach out to individuals who you trust. So if you know they're African American, Black doctors in general, reach out to them and ask for their particular opinion, right? Um, if you know social workers, we have a lot of social workers. Reach out to them and say, you know what, this is what I'm dealing with. What are your particular suggestions in this regard, right? I was going to say be self-educated, but usually when I say that, people just look to Google, which you should not do because, again, don't Google everything. And I have to make this, since this popped in my head, make this statement. Don't ask for medical advice on social media. That's dangerous, number one. And number two, if you have a particular ailment, don't Google it because there's a lot of false stuff out there on the internet, right? If you need to speak to a particular healthcare professional, right? And if you're doubting them, if you don't trust them, speak to a local organization, right? Speak if you know that there's cancer that runs in your family, contact American Cancer Society, right? They're nonprofit, right? If you know there's heart issues in your family, contact the American Heart and Stroke Association. They're not going to turn you down. They'll give you valid resources, incredible doctors to help and assist you, right? And I just named a couple of elements, right? So it's important to, number one, acknowledge the sins of the past, but number two, as a patient, to be empowered and to really seek your own health and reach out to the resources that you could possibly that you have at your disposal. If you don't have any resources, then you could Google American Heart Association in your local chapter, American Cancer Society in your local chapter, or Google social workers in my area or closest to me that they could actually direct you and help you in whatever particular information or assistance that you need. So these are just some practical things that you could do now. But for a bigger standpoint, there needs to be a lot of acknowledgement and repentance from the medical establishment to garner that trust back in communities of color, especially Black communities, and that's very important. So yeah, I'll stop there, and you could comment or ask any more questions.
Well, it's interesting that you said there has to be, this acknowledgement of what's been done, and North Carolina and I believe it's Virginia, North Carolina has already done some reparations to the remaining victims from their sterilization programs. But it seems like in America, for Black people, acknowledgement is they throw money at it. Like I'm sure Breonna Taylor's family, they're going to get a civil suit, they're going to get some money, and they think that's good enough. They think it's enough to throw money to say, well, the family got this, we paid them that for their damages. But it never seems, and I shouldn't say never, that's an absolute, but it seems like the actual changing, though, the actual transformation of practices takes so long to happen. Like we're still teaching, about cultural competency, still talking about that in our healthcare system. And you still run into doctors who don't seem to know how to talk to people of color or even care about, so it's like, it feels sometimes daunting. It feels almost hopeless, if I'm honest. But one of the things I loved about your book is, one, the name alone. So I can't let us end without you going into the stigmata piece. And you talk about in your book what stigmata even refers to, and then you relate it to the Black body. So talk to us a little bit about the stigmata and how it relates to our experience.
Right. Well, stigmata is a symbolism of three things. First, stigmata is usually deemed as a theological understanding. Stigmata means the marks of Christ. So, marks in the hands, marks in the feet, and marks in the side based on the crucifixion of Christ. That is the theological piece. And all of us are children of God. We are shaped and molded in the image of God, and we should be valued and treated as so. So that is the first layer. The second layer is that stigmata also deteriorates the skin. It blackens the skin, right?
Wow.
So that's where the racial element comes into play. Because when your skin is viewed as a disease or as a threat, that brings a whole nother level of oppression. It brings a whole nother level of degradation and dehumanization. What's the best thing about Black folks is that we flipped it and used it as saying, you know what? Our skin by society might view it as these negative things, but Black is beautiful, right? The late great James Brown said, say it loud, I'm Black and I'm proud, right? We flip the narrative of what has been oppressed
Yeah.
upon us and say, you know what? Our skin is, we come from kings and queens, right? Africa wasn't just a bunch of brutes and baboons, but we actually had commerce and we had trade and we actually had sophistication of government and understanding of kingdoms and kings and queens and civilization, right? A lot of things in humanity didn't come from Europe, it came from Africa, right?
It's
But of
stolen.
course, the narrative has been that it has come from Europe, right? And that is not true. A lot of the fundamental anthropological, humanistic type of things started from Africa, right?
Yes.
Because that's where humanity started. That's the cradle of humanity, right? So that's the second piece. The third piece of medical stigmata, of course, it is also a medical condition, right? And because it is a medical condition that can't be cured, we have to find ways to alleviate the pain, right? And as Black folks, we try to find ways to alleviate the pain, right? We, again, in so many different ways, try to alleviate the pain. So what do? We continue to move on. We have this sense of continued precedence of moving forward and always
Yeah.
being optimistic and always trying to do the best we can in really dire situations, even now, right? We still
Even
do what
now.
we can in spite of people being people that look like us being killed and murdered and being justifiably so, right? I think the biggest issue that most Black folks have regarding Breonna Taylor is that they didn't even mention her name. And the only reason why that cop got actually indicted for negligence, I can't remember the actual wanting term, endangerment or something of that nature,
Okay.
was because he shot a wall. So it comes to tell you that a wall has more value than an actual Black woman's life, right? And that is egregious on every particular level, right? But again, when you have a system that has been structured not to protect Black
Right.
people, that's what you get, right?
Right.
And there's two justice systems in this country, right?
Right.
So these are the three elements and the three layers of stigmata, if you will, that I envisioned while I was writing the book. And hopefully, the book has displayed that and illustrated that in the way that will bring people to be, of course, aware, but also reconcile. And yes, Sister Wiggins Chavies, yes, it was wanting her endangerment. Thank
Yeah.
you, sis. I said
Yeah.
sis because I know Linda, so thank
Right.
you very much for
Right.
that. So it's something that is a metaphor for the different elements that is going on in our society today.
Yeah. And it hurts. It hurts, as I'm sure the markings of Christ represent, right? The
Mhm.
stigma represents also that pain to me, of
Absolutely.
what and that suffering that happens. So there's a pain that happens, but what I like about what you also said about it is the victory part, the victory
Mhm.
part of the resurrection, and the victory part for us as Black people that despite all of this coming at us, it's despite 400 years of oppression, despite and it's ongoing and ongoing oppression, we still get up every day and we still fight to exist. Our very presence, our very existence is a fight against oppression. And and so to me, that leaves some hope, right? I know I'm not the only one searching for hope, for where's the hope, God, in all of this, because it does feel so overwhelming. It feels so daunting. Yes, that victory in Jesus, that and we turn back to our faith. We turn back to Jesus Christ as the example. We turn back to what has sustained so many of our ancestors. And that was a deep-seated belief that we as Black people were still children of God, that we were still, that God was on our side and was, as you talk about James Cone all the time, that God is the God of the oppressed, that he is for us, and he will come through and will intervene, right? That is our hope. So I want to just end on just talking a little bit more, though, now that the church is in the space that is in now, right? The church is, we're not the church, we don't look like we used to, meaning we're not in the building, we're not able to gather like we used to. How do we, or how can we, what are your thoughts on how do we leverage this time that we have right now? And I think Peggy mentioned about how we need to refocus and get back to what we were created for, which was not just worship, but helping Black people overcome and survive discrimination and dehumanization. How do we get back to that focus, but how do we leverage this time of reset that we're in to deal with this issue of race and medicine, this issue of race-based medicine, this issue of healthcare disparities and the degradation of Black bodies and silencing of Black voices in healthcare?
Right. Well, first, I'll give you an answer internally, what we should do internally, and then I'll give you an answer of what we should do externally. Internally, the Black church also needs to recognize their own biases, right? So, and I'm not afraid to say this, we need to incorporate Black women and not hinder them in ministry, right? There's still a lot of age-old, really, to be honest with you, blatant ignorance regarding including women in ministry, right? If Jesus Christ, which is the chief cornerstone, who is the prime example, if Jesus Christ had women in his ministry, why do we have churches in general, but especially Black churches, who hinder women in progressing in ministry, right? In the pulpit, right? At every particular, even at the highest level, right? There's so many of our organizations that are all men. Where are the women, right? Right? So, and I could say that and not get in trouble. So it's all good. And I call it, I call it like it is. We really need to incorporate women in our ministry, right? And stop using patriarchy, right? Because how can we actually go out forth and proclaim equality when we hinder the very women in our churches to actually achieve the calling of God that they have on their life? I have countless stories of women who are extremely gifted and anointed, right? And because of the BS, I'll censor myself, of the misinterpretation of scripture,
Yes.
and patriarchy, we hinder women, right? So first and foremost, we need to deal with that issue within our Black churches, right? And if anybody has a problem with it, holla at me. We could have a conversation about that. But that's hypocritical, and we need to just say that's wrong, number one. Number two, once we get that done, and I know this might be controversial as well, we also have the LGBTQ plus community in our churches, right? Now, we could have a whole debate about what the Bible says about these individuals or whatever, but that also has to be acknowledged, right? Because at the end of the day, Jesus Christ himself historically dealt with the people who are the most ostracized socially in that society.
That's
And
right.
and particularly the Pharisees actually hated Jesus Christ. Why are you talking to that prostitute? Why are you talking to that woman? Why are you talking to the leper? Right?
That's
Individuals
right.
who historically were absolutely the bottom of the totem pole. Jesus is the one that hanged out with them folks, right? And we should do the same, following the example of Jesus. So there's an example of being the Christianity of Jesus, which
That's
is the
right.
examples I've said, and the Christianity of empire, which is the complete opposite of that. Those are two
Right.
differences, right? So that's the internal stuff that I had to say. Now, the external things that we could say, once we get that, or at least try to get those two things in order, is to partner, right? Reach out to individuals. Hey, reach out across denominations, right? You know, we're so isolated in our silos, denominational
Yeah.
wise. Hey, ain't no nothing wrong with the Baptists. Reach out to Pentecostal denominations. Say, you know, let's go together. Let's start an alliance that we could bring our money and power and intellect together and create a hospital, or at least create an insurance, health insurance type of company, or at least provide resources for our congregations, right? It's about partnering together. It's also about partnering with these health and wellness organizations. It's about partnering with public health organizations, as I said before, because we have the money, right? How we
Yeah.
allocate and use the money is different. The Black purchasing power is over $1 trillion every year, right? And a great deal of that, hundreds of millions of dollars or hundreds of billions of dollars, goes to the Black church. How are we funneling that money, right? Are we using it to buy property, to be owners, not just to buy a big church, right? But to really use that money and allocate it in a way that's effective for our communities, right? I know plenty of churches that build schools within their communities, right? And they're doing well and thriving and educating our own youth and creating youth programs, right? There's so many different things from a community development standpoint that we could do as
Right.
well, that not only touches health, but also touches what we call the social determinants of health: education, housing, employment opportunities, economic development, parks. I mean, so many different things that
So
we can
many.
do as clergy. So we have to think outside of the box.
Yes.
Um,
A
and
holistic.
that's what we really need to do. So these are my particular suggestions as the quote unquote Black church, but also as a church as a whole that we need to do.
Yeah. Thank you, Kirk. That you were preaching it. You guys can send your offering.
I
We
don't
should.
need no all. I just need y'all. I just need us to come together to get right, check our own biases. And I really feel that like we limit Black women so much in our churches, right? And it's ridiculous, to be honest with you, because they are the crux of they are main cruxes of the church are Black women. But anyway, that's another story from another day.
No, no,
I'll digress. So
no. It's all relative, and I've said it on this show before that part of the issue I have with the Black church right now, especially, is that you'll have the Black church talking about let's go protest for what's going on, but they're still okay with oppressing the women in their church. How can you be against racial discrimination but still be okay with sexism? And then we won't
correct,
talk about the way that we have fleeced the LGBTQ community. Everybody
correct,
knows I have talked about we have fleeced them. We let the LGBTQ community come into our churches. They could be our pastors, they could be preachers, they could be musicians, they could be our favorite gospel artists, as long as they hide in the closet, as if we don't see that they're from the community. But the minute that they
right.
say they're from the community, then and it's terrible, the injustices we've done to that community as well. So
Right. And Tisa, how can we cry out about people oppressing us when we oppress people in our own churches? It's
but
hypocritical.
it's so hypocritical, but it's
We
almost what
explain, we say, racism, 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 but then you continue purport, different phobias and sexism and misogyny within your church, and that is not of Christ. Point
it's
blank.
not.
Christ, historically in the Gospels, Christ did not act like that. Christ did not act like that.
Hey,
And because of that, that's why, in my opinion, certain circles don't take us seriously because we're oppressing people in our own churches. But then, of course, we say, "Oh, wave the red flag regarding racism," right? Which of course we should, right?
Right.
But we have to get it right in our own house first, and regarding our own biases and our own particular way of mistreatment of people in our own communities. That is something, and that's a difficult conversation. And I know I stepped on some toes, but that is the God. Because if Jesus Christ came back right now, you think Christ would have been happy with this? Absolutely not. He would not be. Absolutely not. So I'm more scared of Christ than people that, on the pulpit and titles and all these other type of things, right? It's
It's
not
so
right.
true. It's so true, Kirk. You've been
Exactly. The
preaching
oppressed
tonight.
becomes the oppressor, as
Yes.
our sister Selena says. So
It's so true. So we got work to do. We got work to do. We can't just talk about advocating for our communities, and trying to combat health disparities, discrimination in healthcare, and still then go back to our churches and be okay with oppression and discrimination there as well. We have to
correct.
start walking the talk. We have to start, yeah, did I say it right? Walking the talk. Yeah, we have to start living what we keep preaching about, and really take a second look at how we've allowed all of this oppression to get internalized in us, where we have now become people who are doing the same thing to our own people. We talk about how our communities have been impacted so much by the criminalization of our communities, but we have to be careful because we've bought into some of that on so many levels too. While we're okay with shooting each other, but mind you, there's tons of other people I can think of that can go, but we are so comfortable killing one another because we have even bought into that our lives aren't as valuable as another race lives, and so there's a lot of work to be done. I'm grateful though, because I'm hopeful with people like you out there sharing your voice, writing, teaching us. Again, you guys, his book is Medical Stigmata, Race, Medicine, and the Pursuit of Theological Liberation. You can get the discount. Make sure you get the code, the promo code, get a discount off the book. You want to educate yourself. And you said that there's so many things we have to be educated about, Kirk, because we can't know what to do differently if we don't even know how we got here. And if we don't even know what's available to us as options and resources to do better. Thank you so much, Kirk. We could have had part 3, 4, 5, 6 on this topic.
We're gonna have a whole library of this stuff. It's crazy. But what I will say is I will encourage everybody, specifically for racism in medicine, medical apartheid from Harriet Washington. That's a really great book and a resource, as well as oh my goodness, there's so many. But yeah, I don't want to leave a list, but Medical Apartheid by Harriet Washington is such a great book to really explore extensively, because I really tackled pharmacology, the pharmaceutical industry. But that book extensively has a great history of experimentation and a lot of other elements of racism in medicine. And you could tell Harriet I mentioned it as well. She's a good colleague and friend of mine. So.
Yes, 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 yes. Thank you all for joining us. Again, we got to stay on the wall. Kirk, you talked about praying, but something my pastor always says is prayer is a great place to start and a terrible place to end. You can't just pray. There's got to be some action. I think, Linda, you said it as well. Faith without works is dead. So we got to get educated. We got to get a watchful eye. We got to start getting out of this individualism and now coming back to a place of community so we can live that Ubuntu. Remember Ubuntu?
Right.
I am because we are, where I
Right.
can't be okay knowing my brother isn't. So thank you all again, and we will see you next week, same time, same place. And good night, and God bless.
Peace.